Matt and I have not rehearsed this, so bear with us. But let's start by talking about a few terms. We have some IT people in the room, right? Raise your hands. Okay. I maintain this. I'm the IT director for OMAG. 90% of my job is not plugging in cables or rebooting computers. It's vendor management. IT leadership is not technical leadership. It's vendor management and contract management. We spent months negotiating a contract and doing an RFP process for our biggest piece of software. We'll get to that. We've got a couple of case studies. But that is most of the job. And even if you're not the IT person, then it's definitely your job. So you're going to see a few terms on an IT contract. First and foremost, top of the list, software license agreement. I need a piece of software, Microsoft Office, Adobe, something like that. Maybe it's Tyler Technologies Encode. They're going to give you a software license agreement. Sometimes it's a click-through agreement. You download and install Adobe, and what do? I agree or I disagree. If you disagree, it uninstalls itself. If you agree, they let you use the software. Don't just click, I agree. For one, they're actually asking for a physical signature. But for two, you need to read those things and understand what you're getting into. We'll cover why in a bit. So let's use Encode. Do we have any Encode cities in the room? I know we've got a few. Okay. Encode. You go out and you buy Encode. You say, we need Encode. Why do we need Encode? Well, it's better than Excel. Okay, now they hand you a stack of documents. After you've gone through the process, after you've evaluated and met with them, and the salesperson has patted you on the shoulder, made you feel really good, you get this giant stack of documents. One of those documents is going to be the software license agreement, but it's not the only one. Yeah.
Just sign.
Some of the others are going to be implementation contracts.
And I want to emphasize what he's saying here. What he's talking about are the more complicated relationships we have with vendors where there's actually multiple of these types of agreements. They're stacked on each other and they do different things. They serve different purposes.
So oftentimes you get a big piece of software, and the big contract is something called the Master Services Agreement. Emphasis on the word services, because it's not just buying a piece of software or a license to a piece of software. Now you need somebody to support it, install it, upgrade it, tweak it, configure it, customize it, and teach you how to use it. All of those things are services. So what you'll often see on something like an Encode is you'll have the license agreement. Here's a license to use the software. Now here's the services agreement that says, and to help you use the software, get you to the point where you can even start to use the software, we're going to charge you a lot of money to install it, configure it, etc. This is exactly how it works. That master services agreement is referred to by usually something called a statement of work. And that statement of work says, we're going to install it, and here's what we're going to do. And then maybe a couple years go by and you go, I need an upgrade. Here's another statement of work that says, we're going to upgrade it, and here's all the little details we're going to do. And it's going to take this number of hours. Usually those things will refer to time and materials billing basis, which is number of hours times the hourly rate. And then, of course, any other expenses associated with that. And time and materials is something that an attorney knows because, well, that's how they bill us.
Wait, I can bill?
Huh?
I can bill?
You make a paycheck, I guess. If they're going to host it on their server for you or put it in the cloud, there'll be one of those too. And sometimes...
Well, and an example there, because we have at least one law enforcement personnel and one recovering law enforcement personnel in the room.
Recovering.
Body cams are a good example. A lot of the companies, you can house them locally, or you can pay them to house it in their cloud. Mm-hmm. Well, which direction you go will dictate whether or not you have one of those cloud services hosting agreements. Because in one case, you're taking care of that piece. And think of it this way, when you have the software, and we'll talk about this in one of the case studies, but there are a lot of different components that go into you successfully using it. There's having the software, there's the software actually meeting your needs, there's where the software is hosted. Mm-hmm. A lot of these, the reason that they're separate agreements, even though you just want one agreement, I'm just buying Encode. Well, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
There's encode, there's setting it up. If you've got somebody on staff who you stole away from Tyler, you may not need as much of an MSA as what they're going to offer. But you don't, which is why you're paying them to do something that you could do on your own if you had the expertise, but you don't, so you hire it.
And on top of that, you might not even be buying encode from encode. An example, we have one of our vendor partners out here named ImageNet. And one of their big lines of business, one of the big things that they do is sell a piece of software called Laserfiche, which is a document imaging platform a number of our cities use. So instead of having a basement that's really leaky and moldy full of filing cabinets full of papers, some cities will say, we're just going to scan everything in. That's what they do. They resell as a value-added reseller the Laserfiche platform. So you will buy the software from ImageNet, who gives you a copy of the license agreement for a different company, but you're going to have a master services agreement with ImageNet to do statements of work to install, support, upgrade, and configure. Simple, right? No. That's why this is the advanced class. So, case study number 1. How many of you have ever run into this? A friendly neighborhood government insurance agency tries to negotiate with a vendor that wants to keep their contract the same no matter what. We want to go buy a piece of software. In this case, this a friendly government insurance agency.
Don't say the name.
Okay, I won't say the name, but it rhymes with Schmomag.
Oh, I was saying the name of the vendor that we didn't go.
Oh, I won't say that, but the government insurance agency rhymes with Schmomag. Wants to go buy a new general ledger system, a new accounting package. It's going to be cloud hosted. It's going to have this thing where employees can check their own pay stub and put in leave requests. It's the bee's knees, right? And we evaluate the software. We get all of the sales demos. They give us access to a 30-day trial. How many times have you done that? And we get it in front of the finance people and the IT people look at it, and we talk about security, and we make sure everything's backed up and it's all great and wonderful and every box is checked, and we're like, yeah, let's buy it. Price is right, let's buy it. What's the next thing that happens? They send you a contract.
And I say no. No, I didn't say no. And you know, one thing, just because we didn't rehearse this, so I'm going to go out of order. There are ways to bring in software vendors, and there's ways not to. It could have been easy for finance to say, we need new software, and all of a sudden Kevin showed up with a new one that we've already purchased, and here you go, finance, this will meet your needs. Maybe it will, but chances are it won't, because Kevin knows IT, he doesn't know finance. So we actually did this one the right way. The users that needed the software sat down with the geeks, looked at all the vendors that were available, identified what their needs were, what their processes were, how that might fit within this software. And they got to the point where this was a good solution for us. And then they sent over the contract. And the problem was the contract had several things, and I'll break it down into, I'm not doing that and I can't do that. I'm a city prosecutor. I'm not dismissing your kid's case for driving 98 miles an hour down a 35 mile an hour street. I can, I won't. There are certain things as attorneys we're going to say, yes, you could sign this. Here's why you shouldn't. Here's all the reasons that it's bad for us. Then there are some things we can't do. We can't agree to certain things in a contract, and we'll talk about them in another slide, but this contract was riddled with some standard form language that in the private sector would have been perfectly legal, but because we're a public entity, there are some things we can't agree to. And so I sent Kevin a list of changes. Here are the ones that we have to make, that we cannot agree to these provisions. Here are the ones that I don't like. Here's why I don't like them. And so I'd like to propose that we do this. And I even sent him a couple things where I can't find them in my own documents, but I can find them in other people's documents, typos or commas in the wrong places, things like that. So here are just a few things that, they might want to tweak the contract just because there's some misspellings. None of them. Hard no on everything, even the grammatical stuff that was actually mistakes on their end. Nope, we're not changing it. You're taking this contract or leaving it. So we left it.
Yeah. We said no.
There were other vendors out there, and it may not, I mean, we ended up, I think, with a couple different vendors that ended up doing all the things this one vendor could, but we're not going to sign a contract that, number one, includes terms that are unconstitutional as to us, and number two, had some terms that were just bad. They were just bad for us. And number three, fix your damn contract.
Yeah.
I mean, they would literally not move commas that needed to be moved.
So I always torpedo myself in presentations. I always tell you the big important thing right at the beginning so you can walk away right now if you want to. And the big important thing, if you take away one thing and nothing else from this session, it's this: be willing to walk away from a bad contract. Full stop. Too many of us have gotten in the habit of the contract is the final rubber stamp after we've decided to buy the thing. No. Reviewing the contract is part of the decision. And that's how it worked for this case at OMAG. I'm sorry, Schmomag. That's a success story. I don't consider this a failure, even though we promised the finance department they were getting this brand new shiny piece of software.
That they already got to try for free.
Yeah.
And they liked it. They really liked it.
And then I had to go back to them and say, we can't.
IT and legal became the reason that they couldn't do it. I mean, we've got a good-natured finance director who likes to give us some grief.
I told him.
And yes, he shoved it all over on me.
Right.
But I mean, that can be a real concern where you may have strong personalities in your cities where they may have already found the solution for you.
Mm-hmm.
I found this is going to be perfect, make it happen. Well, it's got to work on the tech side, and it's got to, that can be a whole host of different things that can too complicated for here. And it's got to work on the legal side. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Sorry, what? What we did is we went back to the drawing board. So we actually had another partner that had already been supporting our existing general ledger platform. And I went back to her and said, what other options are there? And she did some looking into it. And she said, well, there's a couple of other solutions. There's this vendor and this vendor. And so I spent more time researching. We went all the way back to the step one of the process and presented new solutions back to finance and found one that we liked. It wasn't 100% of the way we wanted to go, but it got us a lot of the stuff we needed. And ultimately, that conversation, while it took a lot of time, was very productive. And what ended up happening was we took a huge number of manual processes, including pay stubs and timesheets and leave requests, and automated everything. And we got a vendor that was willing to play ball with us. And it's been pretty good so far.
I got paid this week.
Yeah, I call that a win.
So is my wife.
So I get asked all the time, and I know he does too, what do we need to include in our contracts? And I usually say...
And address. What needs to be addressed in the contract?
What do we do what do we put in our contracts? And, most of the time what I do is say, Matt, tell them what to put in the contracts. But usually we hand a contract off to legal and they look at it and red pen, right? Don't worry, you guys will get a chance to do it yourself in a minute. But if you can look for some of these things, actually legal has spent quite a bit of time teaching me what things to look for. And so we included a happy list here. I think we mentioned earlier, don't feel like you have to write all this stuff down or take pictures. We will put this presentation out on our website, omag.org/downloads. Check on Friday, but we'll try and have it up sooner. You'll have all of these little items on there. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's a great starting point.
Who owns your data? I mean, if you're using a vendor that you're going to be putting data in, is it yours? Chances are it's going to say it's yours. It's probably going to also say whether or not it's also theirs and what they can do with it. You'll want to make sure that that's addressed in the contract and that you're comfortable with it. First and foremost, that it's your data. Because if you decide to change that relationship, a bad vendor is going to tell you can't have your data back. That's a hard stop, walk away moment. It's your data, and you better make sure that the contract says that and that you have the right to retrieve it if you're going to end that relationship. Insurance. Many years ago, when cyber insurance started to become a huge hot topic, I mean, probably 14, 15, 16, it started with a major breach at Target. Target had their customer data that was breached and personally identifiable information, credit card information, and it didn't fully get explained in most of the media articles how that happened, but it actually happened through one of their vendors. One of their vendors who serviced, I think, what was it, the HVAC?
HVAC.
One of their HVAC vendors actually had the keys to get into their system, and they hadn't set things up on their end to make sure that they were segregated out and couldn't have access to this. Well, somebody hacked the HVAC vendor, realized the tunnel that the HVAC vendor had to Target, and realized that they went from $1,000 crime to $1 million crime really quickly.
100 million, actually.
The question's going to be, when you have those kinds of relationships, if you're hosting with Tyler and you've got court data out there, you've got data that is PII, personally identifiable information, and Tyler gets hacked, Tyler's going to have cyber insurance. Do you have cyber insurance through them? Are you an additional named plan member or insured on their cyber insurance policy? If they get hacked, it's your data that got compromised. You're going to have certain legal exposures as a result of that. Are you named as an additional insured on their policy?
Question, if you change IT providers, and for years they had your data, but migrated to someone else, they probably still have your data somewhere on one of their servers or hard drives or something.
Sure.
Potentially.
So if something happens, I mean, they could, I guess, some kind of way screw you around.
If they're that kind of vendor.
If they're that kind of vendor.
And there are those kinds of vendors.
So is that what the cyber insurance would cover that? Or other than maybe.
And what we're talking about here is, you guys, if you're an OMAG member, have some cyber insurance through us. And so if you're not named on theirs, you are still gonna have some coverage through us.
Yeah.
But if you hire me to come do work for you, what happens if I screw up? Well, I've got malpractice coverage. Now, the difference between being an additional named insured is, you're not an additional named insured on my policy. My policy is covering your claim against me. But you're going to want to make sure I have insurance, right? Well, if you're using a vendor to do something that affects third parties, you're going to want them to have insurance. But you're going to want to make sure their insurance is also covering you because they're acting on your behalf. But by default, you're not going to automatically be covered under their policy. They are. But you're going to want to make sure that for the work that they do for you, you are an additional named insured on their policy.
So what happens if you move away from them? What is that? Is there coverage there? What happens there?
The coverage, cyber insurance is typically what we call a claims made and reported policy, which means that it's only good for a particular time period if the claim is made, presented, and reported to the insurer, which means that if they cancel their insurance and something happened today, they cancel it tomorrow and the claim doesn't come till the next day. If they cancel it here after the incident occurred, there's no insurance because the trigger is not, you've got liability coverage with us, we have what's called an occurrence policy. The policy that controls is the policy in effect on the day the loss occurred. The difference with the claims made policy is it's not when it occurred, it's when the claim is made. And so if they are that bad and they cancel their insurance,
so cyber insurance policies are a lot different for one big reason. Hackers get into a system, they could be there for 6 months to 2 years.
Yeah.
And it's often very difficult to find out when that initial intrusion took place, when they actually gained access to your systems. So right, as opposed to a car wreck. Your car gets its fender bumped into by somebody, they run into the back of you, you know exactly the date and time and street corner that happened. So that's easy. That's why those are occurrence-based. But the cyber ones are more difficult, where we discovered it today. Okay, that's when the claim takes place.
When did it first happen? We
couldn't tell you.
No idea.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying, though, is what happens if you move away from the vendor, they still have your data, and then the data is compromised.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
So
I guess the concern is that they could potentially lock us out of our own systems if we decide to.
Some maliciousness.
And I will tell you, we have seen instances like this where the only person that has the master password is the vendor.
Yeah.
Right.
And your contract should address that. And they shouldn't be the only ones with the keys to the kingdom. But there are instances where that is the case.
Right. And I've seen plenty of vendors who will refuse to give those keys up. Now, sometimes vendors will say, look, we're happy to give you that key. We're going to ask that you sign an agreement saying, we're not responsible if it gets hacked because you had the key. They may ask you to do that. It may be worth
Which is not
signing.
unreasonable. I mean, what they'd be talking about is,
Yeah.
if we give you the password and somebody steals it from you, that's on you, not us.
Right.
I mean, that's essentially what they'd be asking for, and that's not unreasonable.
But I've also seen vendors where they'll just refuse to give it up. I will say, and this is why I know we can't do anything about vendors in the past and contracts that you signed years ago. But the reason why you're in this room right now is so that any contract you sign from this day forward, you can be thinking about some of those things. So let's cover an easy one real quick. Let's cover an easy one real quick. Data ownership, first one on the list. And by the way, the single biggest question I get asked when it comes to IT contracts. Who owns our data? It's in this cloud thing. I'm not sure what the cloud is. Where's our data? Who owns it? Who can get access to it? Take a look at your document here. It's on the first page, but I want you to find the paragraph that talks about data ownership. First person to find it, yell it out.
Should have built in the Jeopardy music.
Do, 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 do.
I mean, is it under ownership of products?
Oh, it's, 4A, ownership of products.
Either that or ownership and license under 7?
It's number 1, terms of services, E. Because DCH, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe, ability to maintain our audit controls would be compromised, DCH is not able to provide customer with administrative rights to your servers and or data without an express waiver agreed to between the parties. Agreed to.
You
That
want your
means they
data,
don't.
You've got to pay us, and we got to agree.
That means they don't have to agree. They can refuse to sign the waiver.
Did you just make that language up, or did you pull it from somewhere?
I tweaked somebody else's language, but not as much as you would think.
This isn't just hypothetical language. Like he wrote this on his own, but he didn't make up the text.
Some of it I did. I'm mean, though.
All right, so
Oh, you want to go back?
I think I just.
Oh, yeah.
The name of the business.
Oh,
yeah, go back one.
yep, hold on.
Bonus points for that?
If you get it, yep.
All right, so a couple things. Early termination and the hold harmless versus indemnification. Remember, we're public entities. We are subject to a restriction that we call debt limitation in our state constitution, which means we can't incur an obligation in one fiscal year that's going to extend beyond that fiscal year. One of the major things and one of the major hangups as a both city attorney and attorney for OMAG that I see is you'll get these vendors who are used to dealing with people in the private sector who will give you a 5-year MSA. And you're locked in for 5 years. Yeah, no, we're not. We can't lock ourselves in for 5 years.
State statute says what, only 1 year?
It's not state statute, it's constitution.
Constitution, okay.
And it's not just 1 year. I mean, here we are, here in November now. Can I do a 1-year contract today that's binding for the next 12 months? No. Because you're probably a June 30 fiscal year, but if you're like me, where I'm city attorney, we're a December 31 fiscal year.
Right.
Any contract we do today dies December 31 or June 30, depending where you are. There's ways to contract around that essentially, it's what we call a non-appropriation clause, that if we appropriate the money for the second year, then the second year becomes binding. By implication, if we don't, then it's non-binding. But that's one of those things that we can't agree to. We can't agree to a long-term financial obligation. It's unconstitutional. It's not a violation of state statute. It's a violation of the state constitution. Congress gets to run around printing money and incurring debt. We don't. Early termination fees always crack me up because, fine, if you cancel, then thou must pay us this fee. Those are technically constitutional. And we have any city managers in the room? All right, close your ears because I don't want to. The really smart city managers, especially if they know that their council's starting to turn against them and they see it coming a couple years in advance, they'll have a severance clause in their contract. But of course, if they get let go in June, well, they've already been paid for more than 11/12 of the years. There's still money in the budget to cover the severance coming out of personnel services. I've seen some really smart city managers who knew they were getting fired who fully appropriated their severance separate apart from their salary to make sure the money was there, because that's essentially what a severance clause is. It's like an early termination fee.
Guaranteed.
We generally enter a contract that says we got like a 30-day
Mhm.
notice of, I guess.
30 days notice, otherwise it auto renews, which is all well and good unless you non-appropriate, because remember, Municipal Budget Act, you got to have your public hearing and then you got to adopt your budget when? What's your drop dead if we got to have a budget adopted by?
You gotta have one adopted by July 1st. No.
Before that.
June something. June something.
It is either 10 or 15 days before the beginning of the fiscal year.
Right.
And so a 30-day, you will notify us within 30 days or else it's automatically binding. Yeah, that's not worth the piece of paper it's written on, because if we non-appropriate the contract, it's not binding into the next year.
Even if it's in the contract.
Even if it's in the contract, and it becomes a void contract. The contract, if it violates the debt limitation, any provision of the state constitution, in this case, the debt limitation clause, it's void and unenforceable. And this is what I'll usually tell vendors as city attorney when I'm reaching out is, look, here's the deal. This, and this needs to change, because here's the reality. I'm trying to be upfront with you. We could go ahead and sign this and then hose you down the road. Because if we wanted to get out of it, we would just non-appropriate it. You'd sue us for breach of contract and we'd say, yeah, debt limitation, it was a void contract. But that's not how I play. I'm going to tell you not just that we need it changed, but why we need it changed. Anybody here, Chief, I don't know if you've dealt with it, but there's a vendor going around the state that my city is signed up with that has cameras that are license plate readers called Flock. When Flock first came to us, I sent them the same notes and actually got a call from the rep after we had done the deal, and they made all the changes I'd requested in the contract and said, we don't have a problem making the changes in the contract, but our legal just had some questions about what this debt limitation thing is. So I sent them a long email saying, here's the cases. Here's the things you can look at. Here's the constitutional provision. This is why we can't agree to it. And they were the kind of vendor I like dealing with, because he said, thank you. We'll make some changes to the contract so that when we go to future cities, we've already got those incorporated in. We've already addressed it.
So here's another quick tip. And again, this is just that thing that boils down if you take away nothing else. A good vendor is one who you send those changes to and you explain why they're there, and they go, thanks for letting us know. Yeah, of course we'll agree to that. We want to do business in the state of Oklahoma. The bad vendors are the ones who say, no, we're not agreeing to that. That is an easy metric. If you say, we can't sign this because it's against the state constitution. I actually, our case study one, that vendor, I said, we can't agree to this because it's against the law. Like, the law doesn't let us do that. And I'm like, what law? I said, the Constitution. And they go, the Constitution? I said, the state constitution. Oh, like it didn't occur to him that we had one. And that should have been a signal right then and there. Yeah, we're going to back out of this. Because at that point in time, we knew what kind of vendor we were dealing with. Now, I have actually recommended to some cities and towns, when they were already dealing with a bad vendor, you can use that as a cudgel. You can actually say to your governing body, don't renew.
Don't appropriate.
Or don't appropriate. Because we need to get out of this. Because it's awful.
One of my favorite things hearing as the city attorney is when I go back with these changes, and usually it's a good vendor who says, well, we don't mind making the changes, but just so you know, we had this in this city, just sign off on this language. I'm not their city attorney.
They shouldn't have.
Kind of wonder if their city attorney looked at it, but.
I actually said that to our city attorney. I said, well, they just went ahead and signed it. Why isn't it issued? He said, because their attorney probably didn't read the contract.
Or didn't know. Debt limitation is one of these things. A few more attorneys have started to understand it, but there's still a ton of city attorneys out there who don't know it's there and don't understand how it operates. And there's plenty of cases that all you have to do is read them and it starts to make some sense. My favorite is the Anadarko funeral home case, which city had a contract with the funeral home to bury bodies at a fixed amount per grave, and more people died than apparently they budgeted for, and the funeral home still buried the people and then didn't get paid, sued, and lost because they didn't have any money left in that fiscal year to pay it, and the debt limitation clause in operation would have made that contract void to the extent it created a financial obligation that exceeded the available revenues for that year. Real quick, hold harmless versus indemnification. Hold harmless is simply, I won't sue you if you don't, and you don't sue me. We hold each other harmless. We will not assert claims against each other. That is constitutional because it doesn't create a financial obligation. If you rent out your community center to me and I damage it, but we've got to hold harmless, the logic is the city doesn't have to repair it. The mere fact that it was damaged doesn't mean that you have to incur a financial obligation because you don't have to repair it. Indemnification, on the other hand, is where you would be saying, if this vendor gets sued, we'll pay to defend you and we'll agree to cover any money damages. Indemnification is payment of money damages. It's what OMAG does for you. You can't, indemnification is not per se unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional in almost every instance because, one, when is it triggered? Well, it's not triggered until there's a claim, which may not be during this fiscal year. So how can we agree to commit money to pay damages and for legal defense in a future fiscal year doing it this year? We can't. Two, it's an uncertain amount. Now, I've seen indemnification clauses that we agree to indemnify up to this amount of money. At least then it's capped, and we know what the amount is, and if we appropriated that every single year, it could be constitutional. But largely, I refuse to indemnification clauses pointing to debt limitation. Choice of law, form, and what we call form selection, which was too long for there, so we just put venue. Most contracts, and these are these terms that are very difficult to get them to change, and it's not you cannot do this, it's are you comfortable doing it? What law will control when there's a contract dispute between you and the vendor? It isn't necessarily going to be Oklahoma law because the widely accepted across all 50 states is you may enter into the two of us could enter into a contract right here. I could write it down on a piece of paper. We could sign it here in Edmond, Oklahoma. But if it says that Texas law is going to apply and we both sign off on that, then Texas law applies. Even though we're here in Oklahoma, we signed it here in Oklahoma, we both are domiciled here in Oklahoma, we can contract for what law we want to apply. We could also contract to say that, okay, but if we're going to sue each other, even though we signed it here in Oklahoma County, you got to sue me down in McCurtain County. It's what we call forum selection. Or down in Texas, Florida, wherever it may be. So those are the kinds of things that they're not deal breakers, but when you see the laws of the state of fill in the blank shall apply and that any suit shall be brought in the district court for, those are clauses where you want to have a conversation. Are we comfortable with this? Not necessarily a deal breaker, and a lot of times it's the practical conversation of what are the chances there's actually going to be litigation. But just know that's something to be on the lookout for. Just know what you're agreeing to.
Our city manager shot one down. It was, choice of venue was London, England, and everything was in pound sterling.
Oh, wow.
Hey.
And they wouldn't change it because they said, well, we deal internationally, and so we would have to learn the local jurisdiction laws for everywhere, so we have to keep it here. And we're like, okay.
There was a point in time where that might have saved us some money, it being in pound sterling, but not today.
We got 15 minutes. So I'll let him talk about binding arbitration, but a few of these other things here. Consider what the end of the contract looks like at the beginning. In other words, are there provisions in a contract for getting your data back?
Prepare for your breakup.
Yes.
As you're starting the relationship, prepare to break up.
So I did not ask my fiance for a prenup.
She'd have killed him.
We got married and we're not planning on getting divorced. I plan to get divorced with every vendor that I meet and greet.
You might find his body up in your neck of the woods. But
No, thankfully she's stuck it out with me for a little while. So, but I do plan to get
still
divorced.
on new hire probation.
Yeah. She still hadn't changed her last name. Backups. So this is actually one of the ones you guys found. Sometimes it's in the contract, oftentimes it is, and it definitely should be. You need to hold them accountable that they are going to back up your data if they are hosting it. I always do this, and it's not necessarily a part of the contract, but I always request a copy of their audit, cybersecurity audit, as well as any kind of financial audits. They can be redacted. I'm not asking for details that can't be shared. And they will often ask you to sign an NDA, non-disclosure agreement, another type of contract. That's fine. I love looking at stuff like that, which nobody ever says other than me, but I love reading other people's audits because I love finding out what issues they might have, and it's always a mystery. But feel free to ask.
I do want to say, the planning for the breakup, part of this, and we haven't said it enough, is making sure you have the stakeholders in the room. There's the end users, the people who are actually going to be using this thing that need to be taken into account. You don't just want to push something on them. You want to make sure it's a solution that is going to work for them. There's the geeks, the people who are the ones in the background taking care of everything, and there's lawyers. While we're talking about it in the context of contracting, I can tell you, okay, if we're going to break up, here's how we break up. And my timeline for breaking up with a vendor is pretty short. Mm-hmm. But if we're in the biggest piece of software that we have is the software that handles our policies that we issue and the claims. Yeah, we can get out of that contract on pretty short notice. What's going to replace it? If I look and say, okay, we're not happy, we don't have to really talk to anybody, talk to our executive director, they're not happy, so we'll just wait till about 30 days before. No, we won't, because we've got to have another one in place. We've got to get the data pulled out. We got to get it migrated over. And all the while, Kevin has an analogy he uses about, trying to change out the engine while you're going down the highway. You're going to want to make up want to have addressed internally, what does breaking up look like? And from your standpoint, if we were going to move on to another vendor, how much time would you need? How much time would you need? IT, how much time would you need? Now, legal, does the contract afford us the flexibility to do it on these timelines? So make sure that when we're talking about that, it's not just the legal, how mechanically do we get out of it? Functionally, how do we move on?
And we're kind of burying the lead here on our next case study, but when we switched line of business platforms, our policy and claims administration platforms, I built in a 2-year overlap where we paid both vendors at the same time. And that budget went before our governing body. And I said, we're going to pay both vendors for 2 years running. Because that's how long we need to run off one platform and get stable on the other. This is not a 30-day deal.
It wasn't going to take 2 years.
Well, it kind of did, actually.
If it went correctly.
Yeah.
But we wanted to make sure that we didn't say, we think we can get it done in 12 months, and then there were some hiccups with the new vendor, and all of a sudden we're at 12 months, and this vendor's yanking their software. And we've got nothing to work out of.
I will say this, it took over a year because we had to let old policies run out and new policies go into the new system. And that was going to take a minimum of a year. So we built that in, and we're very upfront about it.
Claims was the easiest one.
Yeah, you guys were one and done. One real quick thing here. I am extremely passionate about service level agreements. You often see them with your internet service providers. What this means is if they are down, you get a refund. That's all it is. Now, there's a lot of complicated math and verbiage and whatnot that goes into these things. You'll hear things like uptime and number of nines. That's 99.99999. How many nines are in there? And their guarantees and whatnot. Essentially what it means is that if they fall below their guarantee, you get a credit back on your bill. Now you probably already have this with your home internet. And if you're down for a week, as I was a couple years back, our whole neighborhood was down for an entire week, I called up Cox Communications and I said, I hate blah, 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 and ranted and raved like everybody does. And they said, we'll give you a refund on your bill. You probably have that as well. And if you're doing any kind of hosting or cloud or service agreement along those lines where they are running the IT infrastructure for you, build these in because it holds their feet to the fire. And it makes sure that they have a financial incentive to keep your stuff running.
And by the way, it's not going to be 100%.
No.
If you've got a contract for cloud hosting and they're down for 60 seconds and then back up, you're not getting a refund. If they're down for 3 weeks, what are we paying for? And it will address, what the uptime is and what the standard is, which if they fall below this much uptime, then you get the credit. But just know it's not going to be 100%. And that's patently unreasonable, because if they do go down for 1 minute, you don't need a credit. 1 day, 1 week. I mean, there is a threshold.
We don't. So our number of nines is smaller, 99.9 or 99. Our number of nines is smaller in municipal government. But if that company is providing services, say, to the stock market or a hospital or power generation or something like this, there better be a lot more nines. And they really will. Those situations, depending on the application, will necessitate the amount of uptime, or the amount of downtime that a customer can tolerate before things go poorly. Now, that's part of your calculation. I mean, you can decide, if we're down for an hour, I guess we're down for an hour. It's frustrating, but we can survive. But you're not going to be thinking that way if you have a power plant or if you're trying to make sure that clean water is making it to your citizens. Then it's a much different situation.
So one thing that we do not do very well, and it's not just municipal government, it's all across the board, we don't debrief after our failures to figure out, okay, how did we screw this up, and what should we have seen ahead of time that we could have headed off some of these issues? OMAG, the hypothetical risk pool, when I got there in 2014, you came in 15?
Yep.
And he inherited a nice little problem. So as I got there, we were in the process of bringing our claims adjusting in-house. We had this very, very, very old policy management system that needed to be upgraded. Well, we were already at the very end of getting ready to execute a contract with a huge software provider to
This software was top of the line in the 90s.
way more than we needed, as it turned out. I mean, but here's where we failed. We didn't have the right people in the room. The person that was overseeing the project still used a typewriter. No joke. I mean, he also used a computer.
Does.
Not very well, but he used a computer. And the person that was my predecessor was good at contracts in general, but when it came to the IT verbiage, I mean, it was a legal contract. He couldn't have told you what all these words meant. Now, this was 100 times more than what we needed in terms of software. They gave us the source code. We could literally customize this software. You buy Word, you just get Word. You can't go behind it in the coding and change the way that it works. Well, okay, that's interesting. I mean, this gives us a whole lot of power that we can exercise here, and we can bend this thing to our will to do exactly what we want. Well, who's going to do that? Now, the agreement, and Kevin did a great job when he came on and replaced our last IT director, who was such a pleasant person that nobody wanted him in the room when they were trying to talk through what this contract meant. Essentially, what we bought off was a whole lot more in an annual expenditure to keep this thing afloat, because it was right there in the contract. We had agreed to take on certain responsibilities in terms of customizations and the coding. And we had an IT staff of 2, neither of whom had any experience in the particular programming language that was used. Well, okay, rather than pay them a whole lot of money, we could maybe hire somebody who knew this language. Well, what was it?
$98,000 a year plus benefits.
But the language itself was
Java,
which Kevin told us, this is the kind of language that most programmers that are good don't like using, and they like working in different languages, and the people who are still working in it, we don't want to pay to come work for us. And so instead, we had to pay the vendor to take care of it. Now, we had some people internally who were a little upset, but here's my analogy. This would be like somebody getting upset because he bought a car from the dealership and then found out, you mean I'm responsible for getting the oil changed? Yeah, I mean, if you want us to do it, you can pay us to do it, but you bought it and it's right there. You said you were going to take responsibility for these things and this part of it. You don't have the people on staff to do that. Well, then why'd you agree to it? And the answer is because the people negotiating it didn't understand what it meant, because we didn't have the right people in the room. And there were other failings here. The processes, we did not go through and figure out the way things were working. They just assumed it's claims and policy. It all works the same. Well, no, every entity does it different. And so when we went live in 2015, claims came in-house, I took them over, and we had to change a whole bunch of our processes to make it work with the software.
And then when I showed up, they said, well, you're going to start supporting this. Now, I'll take your analogy one
He
step
had a
further.
full head of hair at that point.
I did. It's very lush. I'll take his analogy about the car one step further. Buy the car from the dealership and then learn you have to change the oil. OMAG bought an old, clunky Formula One race car, performance machine, and handed it to a department that was essentially a couple of guys running a Jiffy Lube and said, maintain it.
And that's not an insult to them at that point.
No.
The only thing that OMAG needed were guys that could get desktops up and go.
We were a couple of generalists, an IT generalists. Neither of us were specialists in this environment and
Well, I
understood
was
it
talking
well
about your
enough.
predecessor.
Well, that too.
You have a few more qualifications than he did. But-
Long story short, we killed that old system just 2 years ago for the last time. So we only kept this brand new, very expensive, very complicated piece of software, or many pieces of software, for about 7 years. And that runoff, that 2-year-long runoff process, that was actually a 4-year project on my part. Because 2 years before that, we started all of what he talked about, that process management, understanding what it's like for the claims department to start a claim, what it's like to issue this type of check. All of that was documented in exquisite detail by staff at OMAG under direction of the IT department, so that when we went to go buy a new thing, we could hand them that stack of documentation and say, this, one of those. We want it to do all of this. Give us one of those, please. And when they gave us a cost, that number was accurate. And we knew exactly how much it was going to cost every year thereafter.
And when we went through this process, and I'll just talk about it from the claim side, it wasn't we click this button, then we click this button, then we click this button. No, forget about the mechanics of the software. What is it you do? Like from the time the claim comes in to when it gets set up, how does it get assigned? Map out the process for us, because we can find then the software and how does it fit in, but does it meet your process? Does it actually accomplish what you're trying to accomplish?
I gather this piece of information. I make this decision, so-and-so approves it. That's process mapping. We are running low on time.
And a lot of times the vendors, we had some processes we were doing manual that our old system, you had to do it manual. New system, you click a button and it's done.
I completely understand SLA. I've been in that world for 25 years. But my lawyer does not know how to write that verbiage. And I'm not a lawyer. So we're kind of at a impasse of how to get that into the contract, because I can't write it.
Don't write it. So here's the dirty little secret about ChatGPT. ChatGPT is wrong. Oftentimes, what it spits out is factually incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the little tip. I get asked this all the time. Well, how do I get good contracts? I can't negotiate. Microsoft isn't going to negotiate with, Glenpool. You're right. You don't have to. You can buy off of state contract. You can also buy off of a bunch of other stuff already negotiated for you and favorable terms for Oklahoma political subdivisions. Now, this is not the magic bullet. This does not solve every problem. There are going to be bespoke software packages that do so-and-so, and they only sell to 4 counties in Oklahoma, and they've never heard of the state, or they're heard of OMES.
Constitution?
Exactly. But it behooves you to start your process by going here to these 4 sites at least, and at least figuring out, has somebody else already worked with this vendor? Sometimes you can buy a piece of software through one of those VARs, software value-added resellers, and they'll be the ones that have essentially negotiated that contract with the state of Oklahoma for you. They're also contracting cooperatives. Essentially, this takes a lot of the work for you. It's not 100%, but it gets you a lot further down the line. So we have cellular devices at OMAG. We have iPads, and we've got cellular hotspots. Anybody else have cell phones or anything like that in their cities and towns? Quite a few. Do you guys know that under the state contract for Verizon and AT&T, if you want to cancel a device, you don't pay an early termination fee? And you have unlimited data when you can't even get that under your personal account. But you have to get a release off of state contract. We do. All of our devices are purchased under state contract. They give you an account, you order the devices using that special account. Go to AT&T's business page and log in under this special account, and then all of your devices are under state contract. No contract to negotiate. It's beautiful.
It's already been negotiated.
Exactly. So these are some of your options.
Please get the people in the room that need to be there. When we're bringing in a vendor, make sure that the people who are actually going to be using it are there. Make sure the people who are going to be supporting it are there. And yes, every so often bring a lawyer. Make sure you're finding a solution, not just that one person thinks is the good solution, but that everybody's comfortable with.